So now that we've discussed the elements of design, today I'd like to talk about the principles of design, which includes balance, emphasis, rhythm, unity, and contrast. So these principles will now need to be applied to a design after the concept has been realized. And so the principles define the sort of like structural foundation of a design and determine how the various elements are organized within the compositional space. So I'd like to both illustrate a few examples for you on my trusty whiteboard and maybe perhaps show a few examples from the history of graphic design to help illustrate these points. So to begin with, balance is the first principle that we will be talking about. Occurs when all of the design elements are sort of like equally distributed throughout the design. So there are essentially two types of balance that you need to concern yourself with: symmetry and asymmetry. And I'd like to go through and walk through these two types of balance. Symmetrical elements are arranged kind of equally on both sides of a composition to sort of like suggest a stable and static motion. And on the other hand, asymmetry, it kind of creates more of a sort of like deliberate kind of imbalance to kind of suggest a variety or a sort of like dynamic movement within the composition. So first is symmetry. And as I mentioned, symmetry, again, kind of denotes that there's equal balance on both the left and the right side of the composition to kind of create sort of like a stable, symmetrical environment within the composition. Another way to kind of quickly illustrate that would be, again, symmetry. So top, bottom, left, and right, things are always static or the same. And then asymmetry, there's an imbalance. Illustrating this point. So things are not quite the same both on the top and the bottom and from left to right. So those are the two basic principles there of balance, symmetry and asymmetry. I'd like to also maybe show you a few examples of that principle in my trusty book here. This is a book on poster history, and I'll just quickly show you here. This image here is a poster, Dutch poster concerning a Dutch shipping line, a cruise line. And so you can kind of see the structure of the poster looks almost like a stained glass window. But also it's kind of symmetrically grounded in that generally the information both on the left and the right side of the page is similar, and the type is also fairly static. So how the type is treated on the left side of the page and on the right side of the poster is the same. So that would be an example of symmetrical balance. here's another example here. This poster here. This is a poster by the famous Russian-born designer A.M. Cassandra. And of course, you know, if you look very carefully here, you can see that the poster has balance on both the left and the right side of the page, and the typography as well is fairly structured, so it doesn't really change from the left or the right hand side. And those are those examples of that. Now, in terms of asymmetry, here's a poster here that I'm pointing to. This is a Swiss graphic designer, Herbert Matter. He's a very famous poster designer and photographer. And this is this poster that I'm pointing to here. And so this shows an asymmetrical arrangement of typography, and that it's sort of like slanting diagonally, which is a kind of a key visual characteristic of Swiss, the International Typographic Style. And you can see that there's also a lot of different principles and elements of design that are operating within this poster, such as texture and rhythm and scale, of course. But here, this would be an example of the asymmetrical balance. The next principles that I would like to discuss is emphasis. And emphasis sort of like indicates the most important element on the page, or for the message. And it's sort of like the element that sort of like stands out or gets the most attention. That's first sort of like noticed on the page. So the most kind of emphasized visual element in a design is sort of like called a focal point. And because it attracts the viewer's attention first. And so how can you kind of create emphasis in a design? It's a question. So that would be by taking the most important element and making it bigger, or making it bolder, or brighter, or by putting it in a sort of like contrasting color, or by surrounding it with white space. And so, for example, you know, if I have a bold letter A, for example, let's say within a composition, and then I have, you know, smaller A's that sort of like surround it. Obviously, the focal point of this composition, because it's not only larger, but also bolder, kind of indicates that it would be the most important element that would stand out on the page. So that would be one way of sort of like determining or guaranteeing that you could create emphasis within a composition. The next element or principle, excuse me, that I would like to discuss is rhythm. And I talked a little bit about rhythm earlier when we discussed the elements of design. Rhythm is sort of like is pattern. You can kind of think of it that way, that these is sort of like repeating elements in a design. And rhythm is kind of denoted by movement in the way that sort of like an element kind of directs our gaze, or how we scan the message for understanding of information. So the term sequence is used to kind of refer to the viewing order of elements and to kind of determine the flow of a sort of like a multiple publication in a magazine, for example. So the idea of rhythm And sequencing and pacing is really important oftentimes when you're trying to get the reader to kind of move through text or information. And a good example of that would be a book. A book has a certain sequencing and rhythm that is built into the design that allows the reader to kind of walk through the book. And so rhythm, again, is sort of like a way to kind of create this sequencing in a way that we sort of like move through a design. So it could be sort of like a snake or a pathway that kind of works its way sort of like through the composition. I'd like to perhaps show you a few examples of rhythm. I think I have some interesting examples to show you. One is a designer in France, and her name is Catherine Zask, and this is one of her examples of her books here. And so even the cover, for example, where the typography is sort of like stacked within the composition, there's a certain kind of dynamic kind of rhythm that's happening in the dots that are sort of like placed within the bold letter forms, as well as the almost kind of strings that you see that are kind of almost attached to the letter forms, as though the letter forms are kind of marionettes. And there's these kind of tethered lines that are kind of connected to the typography. So there's certain aspects of rhythm that are sort of like operating within this design. And so Catherine's work has that certain rhythm that's created oftentimes through the basic element of line that you can see that's kind of connected to the typography. And the typography also is sort of like stretched vertically in this composition to kind of create sort of like a dynamic rhythm throughout the composition to kind of help with the reading of the message. She's kind of taking it a little bit step further in a very kind of experimental methodology in the way that she works with typography. Here's another example here. This is a theater poster for a play, and you can see that not only is the type legible, but also it has sort of like a kind of a cascading, sort of like pushing back and forth, almost like an accordion fold, if you will. So there's a certain kind of rhythm of this sort of like, accordion fold within the composition and within the typography that kind of gives it a certain rhythm and pacing and sequencing. And the same is true for, if you look very carefully at all the typography that's white. It has sort of like a dynamic kind of cascading effect that sort of like works its way, kind of ripples through the composition, as well as the black typography that not only kind of creates contrast with the white typography, but also creates a sort of like dynamic rhythm that sort of like works its way through the overall composition. So that's the work of Catherine Zask. I think that's a great example of a rhythm. I talked also about the term sequencing and how sequencing is used to kind of refer to the viewing order of elements that kind of determine the flow of multi-page documents like magazines and periodicals and publications. I have a book here. This is a play by Jean Cocteau, and it's about a play about the marriage that takes place on the Eiffel Tower, and it's all narrated in just typography and color. And this was designed by the very famous French designer Robert Messine. And the French have a really interesting way that they work with typography. And oftentimes it's very kind of expressive in the way that they treat typography. But if I just kind of flip through the book really quickly here so that you can see, I don't know if I can kind of just kind of quickly walk through the book, but you can kind of see that not only do the pages turn color, have different colors, but also the typography, there's a certain contrast and pacing and all kinds of elements and principles of design are being placed within the typography to kind of create a really beautiful and lively kind of rhythm and pacing throughout the book. So obviously color is an important element that's kind of being used here to kind of create a dynamic experience as you kind of walk through the book. And unity is another a principle of design that I would like to just kind of quickly walk through with you. And unity is sort of like achieved when all of the design elements kind of relate to one another and project sort of like a sense of completeness, if you will. And the viewer will always try to seek unity within a message or within a composition. So without it, the viewer will kind of lose interest. So it's really important to think about how designers kind of use ideas to kind of draw on almost like a Gestalt theory to kind of help unify the design. And we'll talk a little bit about Gestalt theory as well, which is kind of a psychological process by which the viewer sort of like unites disparate ideas for grouping or for kind of figure ground. And so grouping and unity kind of happens when all the elements are kind of close together and visually appear as part of a group. And again, this is sort of like where figure ground or negative and positive occurs when a viewer can kind of identify an object and a shape that's distinct from the background. And this perception is sort of like dependent on the design principle of contrast as well. So I'd like to just kind of show you here very quickly unity, and I'll just do that by creating these this really basic form, on the page. Just using the element of line. Okay? So there's a certain kind of grouping, if you will, or unity that occurs here that all feels, kind of connected, and that there's a certain kind of sequencing and repetition that kind of gives it structure. And we always look for ways as viewers to kind of seek, that unity within design. So, and I talk a little bit about this, sort of like this, the grouping or the figure-ground relationship, which is, of course, part of unity. And there's a few examples that I would like to show you that I think are excellent examples here. This first one here is quite a amazing design. This is by the Japanese designer Shigeo Fukuda, and he likes to work with this really kind of strong element of contrast in design. And of course, contrast is the last principle that we'll be talking about in design. So there's a few things that are sort of like operating within this composition. Not only contrast, but also this idea of the figure ground or the negative positive space. So for example, Fukuda really utilizes this method within his work, and I think it's rather obvious here. This example kind of shows, you know, this is actually for a department store in Tokyo, and he created this design, so you can kind of see the typography is just kind of placed down at the bottom of the page, and then the image making is really the dominant, the most important aspect of this design. But more importantly, it's the unity or the grouping. So the white space of the background, the white space of the page, becomes the image. Where if you look upward, you can see that there's a leg and a foot with a shoe turned upside down, right? And also, kind of flip it this way, you can kind of see that. But also, when I flip it back this way, you can see that there's both a man's foot and a woman's leg and shoes in the negative space. So there's a really kind of strong relationship between the figure and the ground relationship. And Fukuda, being sort of like a master of illusion, really kind of works with this in a really powerful way. This is an example of just a logo. This is a logo for the Deutsche Bank in Germany, and this was designed by Anton Stanowski in well, 1974. And so this, I think, is another good example of unity or grouping, where there's just such a strong, bold contrast that's developed in this design, and it's using just very basic shapes. So this would be referred to as a very kind of abstract logo, but there's a really strong kind of relationship between the background space and the elements on the page, the figure-ground relationship. Another example here is a poster by the Swiss graphic designer Nicholas Troxler, where there's it's a little bit more of a subtle design solution, where he's kind of using typography to create the profile of the musician. I think it's a really kind of a nice idea to use type to create a profile. And there's a certain kind of